How do you like your coffee? And what does that have to do with coaching Black Americans? Obviously a metaphor. So if I'm looking for coffee, there's some intended impact and effect I expect from the coffee. I mean, it's something that I'm looking for that's going to get me stirred up, and there's something about the robustness of coffee in its intended form, even the color, literally, black coffee. Now, what are you looking for, and what do you get if you add a little cream? I mean, kind of obviously dilute the color, move it down a notch or so from that robustness to a little bit more mild flavoring. Maybe you add 1 or 2 sugars, and that, of course, sweetens the intake. You might be one of those that likes a little bit of whipped cream on it, you know, just to tickle the entry even more so. But some of you might actually drop a few cubes of ice in it, so that you end up with this really kind of contradictory thing called iced tea. Well, I don't want to overwork the metaphor right now. Let me give you a little bit of background about why I even asked the question about coaching Black American executives. And I have to tell you that, first of all, I believe that differences make a difference. Some of you might actually believe that ultimately we're going to be all recognized as a part of the same race, the human race. I saw in the airport they said one race meaning mankind, and I don't know what that does to you if you don't happen to be in that man category. So some of you might believe that differences do make a difference, and some of you, may not. Some of you may be like the person that interrupted me years ago when I started out talking about diversity, and they said, I don't even know why we're talking about diversity, because after a few minutes of hearing you talk, I don't even notice that you're Black. Now, you may have the superpower of whitewashing me. I don't have, nor would I choose to use the superpower of becoming an invisible man. So I do believe differences make a difference, but it's a valid question to ask that if fundamentally, as an executive, my charge is to be as effective as possible, utilizing all my resources, driving the organization to results, and managing those resources. So, legitimate question, what difference does it make that you are different or that I am different? So let me tell you, I wanted to answer that question and not just base it on my own personal hunch. So I had an opportunity to look at some senior executives after working with hundreds over the years, and a few subsets of whom were Black executives. And I wanted to get from them examples of stories that they would share when they thought they were their most effective, and stories when they were least effective. What were you doing? What were you thinking? What was the outcome of that? What would you say attributed to you being successful? What would you say attributed to you being less successful? So I took those stories and did thematic kind of analysis of that. And what I want to share with you are some assumptions that I came away with that really frame my approach to coaching this particular population, and offer them to you as at least something to provoke your thinking about what you might be aware of, what might lie beneath that difference, and really to offer to you at least a couple of questions that I have used that I think help pull those dynamics or differences out a little bit more. And as a bit of a preview, I do want to share with you a snippet of one of the stories, which was from a person who was Black American, ended up being CEO of a Fortune 100 company here in the US. This was after graduating from an Ivy League school, after attending Wharton Business School, after working at Boston Consulting Group, after serving as the CFO of this particular company, after being told you need some operational experience, so he ran one of the businesses, and then after they said, well, you might still benefit from going to that Harvard Executive Ed seminar. So once they told him that, he stepped out in the hallway and said, what does a Black man have to do to become CEO here? course, somebody was listening, and then the murmurs that persisted afterwards included things like, oh my goodness, what's wrong with him? Are we going to inherit all of that kind of reaction? Is it just going to be about race? So I had the opportunity to talk with him about it, and one snippet of the story and reaction he shared really struck me and kind of weaves through all these other 5 points. So he said, look, you don't get here without knowing that there is a black tax that you have to pay. It's just on that day I got beside myself and forgot to not say it out loud. Okay? So let me give you some more of those basic assumptions. What I think you should look for, what might be a little bit, and certainly from these stories that is, if you peeled it back a little bit, you might uncover. And then in the end, at least offer to you a question you might ask in your role as a coach, or even if your role as a leader for Black American executives. Race matters. I mean, I think we're fundamentally wired to collect data, to put it into categories, to analyze that data, and then to do something in reaction to it. So this group, I mean, without a doubt, they said, of course race matters. Now, on the surface, you might not hear them say that. What was interesting in the stories, too, was this frustration of acknowledging that, for the most part, effective leaders that they worked with had some real fundamental core management skills of being able to see patterns. I can tell this division is not performing the same as this division. I can tell, so the pattern recognition about behavior and performance in the organization, leaders have that as a core skill. This group was frustrated that the same skill, for some reason or another, when you presented the question about race, just went out the window. So if I brought up the question about, I don't know, this may have something to do with race, the worst thing you could say is, what does that have to do with anything? To dismiss it. So the very first one I'm giving to you is that understand that race matters. Sometimes we used to talk about, particularly in the US, about playing the race card. As a sidebar, I have had colleagues from other parts of the world who would say, this is a peculiar problem for the US, race. Person happened to be from India that comes to mind. And I said, well, if I changed it from race and said colonialism or caste system, would it make any difference? And at least they paused to think for a moment. Fundamental thing that I want you to get from this is that being different shows up because we naturally process it. And if you're tuning your ears to listening, there's just tons of opportunities that are out there. So some of the stories included things like, I'm not sure if I fit in here. I'm not sure if I'm the right person to come here. I'm not sure if this company is ready for me. I'm not sure. So that questioning, opening about, I'm not sure, and you're sitting there in front of someone who looks, for all intents and purposes, to be sort of in the female category, or for all intents and purposes seems to be sort of in the tall category, sort of in the person of color category. So I just invite you to take the risk of saying, why would you say that? That's a safe one. The other thing I want to tell you is that this group said, look, we have a whole lot of experience answering the question. We recognize and appreciate that people who are not from categories of difference don't really have a whole lot of experience or comfort in asking it. So the race card is always there, both for you as a coach and for that executive. Race card is always there, maybe face down. Trust this data point that says that it's probably easier for you to raise it than it is for them. And you're going to raise it in a way and it's going to bumble and so forth, but there's something, a big payoff about that. So the question about race matters, what difference does it make that you are? That's slightly more direct. Before there is that, just listen, okay? I'm not sure if I belong. What makes you say that? And just pull it out from that perspective. So race matters. Rumors of inferiority persist. Now, if we do categorize people in different groups, that in and of itself can be arguably pretty objective. Okay? I have people sitting on the right side of me, people sitting on the left side of me. So categories in and of themselves is not the problem. It's what do I attribute as a value to those categories? And then broadly speaking, if the categorization turns out to be one of a deficit or a deficiency, then we're headed down a path that might be a little bit more problematic than we intend. These rumors of inferiority persist because I think is a particular example about a deficit, particularly for persons of color, particularly in the US and corporate settings, and it all hinges around this notion or this belief that fundamentally people of color are not as intellectually gifted as others. Now, as a psychologist, I went through graduate school, and there's tons of data that would lead you to come to that assumption. There's representation in corporations that would say, must be some reason why we don't have more of them at that level. So I'm not arguing the point about, the data, we're arguing the point about the attribution. Particularly for persons of color, this question about, are you capable of fulfilling this role stands out. What was also interesting from the stories is that the dialogue shifted from how smart are you to are you strategic enough, which is arguably a euphemism for the same thing. Okay? What makes it even more challenging to uproot is that these stories included snippets that had these types of comments in them. They told me I was actually pretty smart. Actually pretty smart. They told me, you're not like other folks in this role. What do you mean, other folks in this role? Okay. They told me they weren't sure they're going to accept somebody in this role, and then they remembered that you're going to an Ivy League school. Oh, that's different. What's even more challenging is that if you grow up in that environment of being told you're smarter than I thought, or you're smarter than the rest of them, or I'm not sure that you belong, or we're going to give you the interim role rather than the permanent role. If you grow up in that environment, and this is what these executives are also admitting to, how much of that rumoring of inferiority starts with me. And one other example, this is working with a white executive who was really frustrated about being able to get feedback to his direct report who was black, because he was frustrated that this person always chose to use a 50-cent word when a 5-cent word would do. Okay? So if you talk to that person of color reporting to them, there's underlying current here of what are you trying to prove? Do I really belong? And I would ask you to consider that as a question both to the person you're coaching, but also to yourself. What am I trying to prove? Okay? But there's something about those rumors of inferiority that they were wrestled with throughout. The other one I'll quickly share with you is someone who was a senior executive trying to get into the executive suite, and his biggest challenge was, do I give up my identity to go to that next level? And that really overlaps this part, this third one, Warring Souls at Peace. Hopefully you're all familiar with W.E.B. Du Bois. If not, please do read early 1903 or so, The Souls of Black Folks, where he talked about there's this fundamental challenge in the U.S. of color, and there's this double consciousness that Negroes, we called us at the time, but this double consciousness of having to see yourself through the eyes of others. So this one came out in the stories in the guise of just how black can I be in this setting. And part of the interesting stories and answers were, I can be black when they ask me to be black. So when the discussion goes to, you're black, what do you think about it? But a very different receptivity and openness to that color versus someone saying, look, we have an issue here. Invite me to be black, I'll do it. Don't invite me to be black, you might resist it a little bit. Now, I have a client that is in the fast food business, and the thing that they sell is chicken. You know where I'm going? I love chicken. Well, I told them that you do not have permission to use me in any marketing campaigns, okay? I love chicken. I don't like watermelon. What does it mean to talk right, white, right? There's something about the identity that's always this challenge and warring peace. And so that's what we talk about as warring souls at peace. How can I get to the point where I'm comfortable being as, I started to say being as black as I want to be, but how can I be comfortable enough to bring my whole self to this organization and to this environment? And so everyone nods their heads about being authentic and bringing your whole self, but I just want you to appreciate that this is a group that says that to the degree I strongly identify with X being color at this moment, I'm trying to figure out how much of that you really want to accept. What are you hiding? It's a little more psychological one. What are you leaving behind? What part of you don't I get to know? More how-to suggestions than hugs. Now, good coaches know that there's some critical piece about coaching that's around the affinity and the connectedness and, you know, establishing the relationships and so forth. And if you don't notice already, it's pretty common when we come into a gathering of people and I see someone, a person of color, we do this little bit of a hug moment, right? This one. Did you see that? This one, okay? It's like, what's up? This is okay? All right here? You with me? You with me? So some degree of affinity, and it comes in different forms, and this is why we also raise the question of, is it fundamentally more productive for a woman to coach a woman or a black to coach a black and so forth? What's very striking about this group of executives is that, look, affinity is good, connection is good, and so forth, but I'm trying to figure out how to navigate in this environment. So you can accelerate that relationship by having some common cause, some common identity, but they were absolutely clear about, tell me what to do in terms of navigating. This question really works for me. You know, even when someone is saying, I'm not sure if they like me here, if I can make it here, and so forth, if I can get them to grab hold of who, like you, has done it in a way that you could, okay? And that gives me a tangible, concrete kind of example of whatever the black tax is, someone figured out how to pay it, and they figured out it was worth it, and they figured out the probability of being successful in that regard. Similarities and differences matter. When I first did this one, the fifth one was race doesn't matter, because I wanted to convey the point that if you work through those first steps, you can get to a point where race doesn't really matter. And then I had too many people say, yeah, that's what I'm talking about, race doesn't matter, forget all other stuff. So I thought, let me slow it down, hold up just a little bit. So do a little bit of a twist on it and acknowledge that my similarities do matter and my differences do matter. You might say when, and the answer to that is sometimes, but I've got to process that information in order to get to that point. So I do want you to take that into account. And one of the things that, in terms of a question that goes with that, I worked with this guy who was a Cuban American at the time, and he said, what's wrong with me choosing a black American if both of them are equally qualified? And this question occurred to me. Well, I mean, it's fundamentally trying to get the right person in the job. So same exercise, how would you choose between two black Americans? So then it doesn't become just a color issue, it becomes the underlying capability and competencies that are important to the job and to the role. If you do believe race is important, makes a difference, and it happens with other groups, same exercise. I'm giving you the basis from my personal experience in these interviews, but this is an open question. Are there other categories of differences, dynamics of differences that you can tune yourself into even more and be more effective in unraveling those? So back to my analogy. When I did this the last time, I thought somebody who's really analytical is going to say black coffee, but in a white mug. And then my counter was on a black basis. The similarity is when I go for something in the morning, I want it to stimulate me and get me started. The similarity is it could be Coca-Cola, it could be cocoa, it could be coffee. So there's a similarity there, but there's something very different about each of those. And so the part I really want to leave you with is that sometimes appreciating the difference is really worth the heat. Thank you.